Good afternoon. My name's David Vogan. I'm the current president of the AMS and here to introduce the immediate past president. Eric Friedlander was born in Puerto Rico, grew up on a farm in Northern Virginia, and graduated from Swarthmore College. He earned his PhD at MIT on étale homotopy theory under the direction of Michael Artin and the influence of Daniel Quillen. A reviewer of one of his early papers wrote, "This paper may seem somewhat formidable. However, it contains an excellent exposition of how homotopy theory is done in a general model category. The reviewer cannot think of a better introduction to the beautiful style of proofs which one encounters in this theory." I won't tell you in detail about a more recent review which says the authors managed to answer difficult questions. The advent of these new ideas makes one optimistic that more interesting results will arise in the future. After 5 years at Princeton, Eric spent 33 years at Northwestern before moving to USC. He says that collaboration with mathematical friends, including Bill Dwyer, Blaine Lawson, Guido Mislin, Brian Parshall, Julia Pevsova, Mark Walker, and most especially Andre Suslin have formed his mathematical life. Eric has served the AMS as president, for 10 years as a trustee, as a member of 4 of the 5 AMS policy committees, and as an editor. Always he has served, as the saying has it, to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. It is a privilege, an honor, and a pleasure to introduce Eric's retiring presidential address, Reflections on a Mathematical World.
No.
The green light's on, so.
So maybe it is on. This is my prop, but unfortunately I can't consult it, just in case butterflies take over. It has really been an honor, a privilege, and a lot of fun to be president of the AMS. It was so much fun that I didn't really discuss this with David, but I was thinking about a coup. And I envisioned being president for life. So I thought about this and went home with this idea, but unfortunately not even my cat liked the thought, so it died quickly. But it's been a lot of fun and very interesting. AMS is a fantastic organization. And what I'm going to do, I'll begin by mentioning a few topics that came up in the last couple of years at the AMS, and I hope you're all aware of them, but unfortunately, communication is not always the best, so I'd like you to know about them. And then I want to take a really potted history of the last 40 years or so to lead into the moment now when I think the math community has to change. And so I'm clamoring for certain changes to occur, and you'll see this. So there's a serious side to this that in many ways mathematical community and mathematics is at its apex in all sorts of ways of influence, in terms of research achievements, in terms of young people going into the subject. But there are a lot of pressures on us. And academia in general and the mathematics community in particular, and myself especially, are very conservative. But I think we have to change. And so that's going to be my final message. So if I can work this, we'll advance. So the first issue, and I hope I can walk because I can't stand at a podium. The first issue that I wanted just to briefly mention, and this was the only one that I was permitted to contact the entire membership about, was a proposal to change the name of the Division of Mathematical Sciences of the NSF. Well, the NSF, from my perspective, has been extremely important and influential in American mathematics, and I feel very allied, associated, and want to do everything possible to continue its role, very important and honorable role in research mathematics and in education. And this proposed name change, I was told by several people in the NSF, including reasonably high up, was more than just a change of name. And I was concerned about this, and I was concerned about this because I was worried that the National Science Foundation might lose, to some extent, its focus on basic research and its focus on the core. And by the core, it was not a fight, and it is not a fight. In fact, I hope we're a friendly group, although there were some awkward times. It was not a fight with statistics, and it was not a trying disassociation with any of these groups. In fact, a former AMS president, Jim Glim, always talked about the big tent. And I subscribe to that we in the mathematical sciences community, if you will, but I'll abbreviate that as mathematics community, should be all-inclusive. And certainly, statistics is becoming more influential and getting more involved in much of mathematics. And similarly, biological science is now, mathematical biology is a big thing and an important thing, and the mathematics that comes out of that's important. And the same with computational sciences. There was no issue about supremacy or influence or whatever. It was that the core should not be neglected. And there were concerns I had, and maybe some people within the NSF who contacted me had, that this could happen. And so there was a lot of discussion, and I reached out to the community about this discussion because I thought the name change was important. And I quote here, and you can read it more quickly than I can read it to you, part of the original mission of the NSF, it's to promote the progress of science. And it needs to keep that way. As far as I know, the National Science Foundation is the most influential and basically the only agency of the US government that supports basic research. It needs our support, and we need its support. So another aspect that's important, and maybe of growing importance as we try and preserve the role of mathematics in society with all these financial pressures and other pressures that are upon us, especially upon academia, is the relevance of mathematics to society, not just its internal beauty. And now I'm the wrong person to address this, since unfortunately none of my work that I know of has ever been applied. And I regret that. I remember G.H. Hardy was very proud of this. I would be very proud to do things that had some constructive role in society, but most of you in the audience do. And this is extremely important for the mathematical community as a whole. And because I'm the wrong person to talk about this, I'll just mention that there's the NRC group, the Mathematical Sciences in 2025, have a wonderful booklet, Fueling Innovation and Discovery, which is pictured here. And every dean to whom a mathematics department reports should have this on his desk. So if you don't know that your dean has a copy of this report, you can get it from the National Research Council, and I think you can get it from free. The National Academy of Sciences will provide it. So there are all sorts of issues about how the public views us, how we view the public. And one thing that really raised my hackles was this Andrew Hacker article in the New York Times. It wasn't just any old article in the New York Times. You open the New York Times on a Sunday, and it was the primary op-ed piece with a picture and really raised. So you can guess that as a social scientist with an axe to grind, he said no. And various people rebutted this in terms of the comments in the New York Times. And there were many, many comments. They were all almost against Hacker's premise. I, not knowing how to write anything that the public would read, sent things off to the New York Times, Washington Post. They weren't printed or published. But some rebuttals did make an appearance. But we have to continue to reach out to the public and withstand some bizarre points of view. And with that in mind, I want to remind you that there's a panel discussion on Friday at 2:30. It's called The Public Face of Mathematics. It's sponsored by the Committee of the Profession of AMS. And it's a distinguished panel. Keith Devlin has probably written more popular books in mathematics than anyone else. Jerry McNerney is a US congressman, a PhD mathematician who's really interested in science. He's not a politician, just happened to get a PhD. Kathy O'Neill, you probably know her, she writes the Math Bay blog. Tom Siegfried was at one time the editor-in-chief of Science News. Steve Strogatz, many of you probably read his long-running column in the New York Times. And maybe they can help many of us to reach out to the public more effectively. So another issue that's a continuing issue, and I'll mention just briefly how there's something happened yesterday, but I still can't figure out what happened yesterday, about publications and open access. So some of us, maybe me more than many people, have been quite concerned about gold open access. Open access, it's like motherhood and apple pie. Everybody supports it. If you open the New York Times, I don't think I've seen any opposition to it, for example, in the New York Times. But I see it as somewhat of a threat to the mathematical community. We are a small science. Many of us don't have grants, or graduate students don't have grants. And you could say, although my colleagues always object to this, that gold open access means author pays. What it means is the costs of a journal are freighted up front before the article is published rather than at the end point where libraries subscribe. Now, various journals and publishers are arranging to waive author charges, or whatever they are called, article APC, article preparation charges. But I worry what the effect of gold open access could be, whether it's going to be that those people with grants and money from universities will be able to dominate the publication and the literature, or whether we'll still be as democratic and as open as we have been in the past. And this is an issue that has challenged some of us in the AMS, and Executive Director Don McClure has come up with a very imaginative way for the AMS to at least do the most honorable thing and yet get its toe into this gold open access situation. But this is one of the issues that I think the membership has to engage in and be aware of. So I mentioned, I believe this bill was passed yesterday. It passed the House yesterday and the Senate the day before. It's the Omnibus Appropriations Bill. The US government has a budget for the first time in 2 years and slipped into that budget. It's a very large bill. It was something about open access, and I'm not sure what it means. But I gave a quote here. Every agency, as of last August, had to give something to the Office of Management and Budget to say what plans it might have to have full faith in open access. But now here is a law, and I guess it has the consequence of law. And this means that basically the camera-ready published version of an article has to be placed somewhere, and I'm not sure where, has to be placed somewhere no later than 12 months after publication. And we don't know, or at least I certainly don't know, what are the immediate consequences for us. The first thinking is that just putting a paper on the archive doesn't suffice. Now, this is only, of course, for those people who are funded by grants, but we don't want to really separate society or the community between those who are funded by grants who publish in certain journals and the rest of the world or something like that. So this is an issue. So the final topic that I'll mention, and then it'll be the subject of the rest of my talk. In February 2012, the President's Council of Advisors in Science and Technology released a report. And I had no advance warning of this report at all. It was a bombshell. This report was extremely critical of teaching by mathematicians of mathematics in the first 2 years of colleges and universities. And as far as I can tell, PCAST, which is extremely distinguished, but unfortunately has no mathematician among its however many members, PCAST did not talk to a single mathematician who was teaching calculus. They did talk to a few people, but those people maybe were sworn to silence because I wasn't aware of what was being discussed. And they came out and came with certain recommendations, basically at its most extreme, at least to have a national experiment of taking us, professional mathematicians, us, people in mathematics departments, taking us out of the classroom in teaching for the first 2 years post-second in colleges and universities. Well, this was a tremendous jolt, and I was extremely well intended, and I think it achieved its intentions despite the details of the report. I think it really has sharpened some of our minds and has really made us concerned. And I'm going to be talking about some of my thoughts about this improving education. Now, it didn't start with PCAST. In fact, the AMS Committee on Education had certainly since I began as president, I wanted to move the formal focus of education in the AMS to undergraduate level. So I didn't want to persuade anyone who is working with K through 12 to change. I mean, we need all the influence we can with and the help, Common Core, teacher training and whatever. But I thought it was high time for us to move towards post-secondary education, and then PCAST gave us this jolt. So that's what most of my talk will be about. So my role is a little bit like Paul Revere, and I'm going to say, as you'll see, that the times have changed and we have to adapt to the times. And I think that is very consistent with the PCAST report, although maybe said in somewhat different words. So as David mentioned, I grew up on a farm. I thought it was great fun. I did things like shoot guns and whatever. I mean, and it was a little hard to leave the farm, actually. But I mentioned my coming from a farm and then being AMS president because that window from the late 1950s to now is the time, it's the background of these changes that I want to discuss. I won't probably mention myself again, but it fits in my career. So in the early years, and I put 1965, 1975, for example, these were really golden years for academia, and I think they were the good old days, and in many ways. And in some ways, they were harsh, they were not inclusive, there were obviously many negatives to it. But in terms of funding, in terms of looking for jobs, things were much better in those days. In fact, we used to grumble about how hard it was to get a job, and it is so much worse now. I mean, the pressures on our society, our mathematical society, are so much harsher and heavier now than they were in those days. So I want to explain a little bit about how this evolved, and the reason I want to explain that is I want to say that the forces that created the really good times of the past are no longer there. And we have to recognize that and respond accordingly. So one of the people I credit for the good days is a remarkable man, Vannevar Bush. I believe he was vice president of MIT. MIT seems to figure in this story. He was founder of Raytheon. He was basically the head administrator for science in World War II. So, for example, for a while, the Manhattan Project reported to him. But for this story, he had this vision of the National Science Foundation. I think quite a few people had the vision, and he was very strongly in favor of supporting basic science. So, in fact, he was pushed away a little bit, but his point of view was preserved. He wanted basic science to be owned by the scientists. He wanted grants to come to the scientist, and then the work would not be secret and for example, like working for the NSA. So he had this vision of supporting basic science after World War II and supporting scientists to do their good work, not distribute the support equally among population groups, but just to be, have as goal the achievement of science. So the NSF was launched in 1952, was its first full year of operation, and I say there, I didn't remember the number. There were 28 grants in all of science the first year. So the very beginning of the good old days, there were 28 grants in science, and I didn't look up how many, if any, grants in mathematics there were. So in roughly this time, another person I think who was very influential in raising the prestige and the impact of science was the great mathematician John von Neumann, or Johnny, as those people who I know who knew him. He was apparently an enfant terrible. Maybe some of you have seen Beautiful Mind, and you know how John Nash approached John von Neumann, and he was terrifying, John von Neumann, but he was absolutely brilliant, and he was both a pure and applied mathematician. I believe he published his first papers in logic and set theory. And I have a couple of quotes that I've stolen from Sylvia Nasser, who was speaking at the Institute for Advanced Study, where John von Neumann was for many years, and maybe just read the highlighted bits in red. So he interacted and did mathematics in so many areas, or mathematical science, like helped to find computational science, meteorology probably owes its birth to him, economics, certainly game theory, whatever. But this says that he showed that formal mathematics could yield fresh breakthroughs in their fields. So John von Neumann really had an influence on the role mathematics had in society and the recognition that mathematics was important. But he also said the comparable part, that he made the enterprise of applying mathematics to the real world discipline seem glamorous. And I think he really did have an effect. In fact, Peter Lax, another former president who's not here, told me maybe 40 years ago that he thought the direction of mathematics might have changed if John von Neumann hadn't died as early as he did. His influence and his enthusiasms for certain directions, and certainly for applications, were remarkable. So another thing that influenced me in my student days and helped to boost science in the public view and to boost the investment of science and thereby mathematics was the launching of Sputnik. So those of you who don't know any history, and I don't know much, but any history more than about 1 or 2 years old, you should think about the launching of Sputnik as some team other than your favorite team winning the Super Bowl. The whole American public got very competitive and had to compete with the Russian space program, whether it were sensible or practical or not, although there were military reasons to be concerned. So Sputnik was launched in 1957 and the government responded. And part of the response of the government in the 60s was the man on the moon. There was a response to the Cold War. The Cold War was very good for science. It was very good for mathematics. And at that time, it seemed an absolute given to me that the best, the brightest students went into mathematics. I remember being in Germany, it probably was 10 years later, and I was surprised that German universities would say that they couldn't attract the best students. The better students would maybe say they would go do mathematics to get into university, and then they would go into medicine or computer science. And I thought that was amazing. In these days, in the 60s and early 70s, mathematics was a tremendous draw, and science had great respect. But I guess the biggest concrete thing that made the good old days good and made those times look lavish in comparison to now were Lyndon Johnson's push for the Great Society, and in particular the Higher Education Act of 1965. And if you read what this says, low interest loans for college students, subsidized libraries, new graduate centers, new technical institutes, classrooms for several 100,000 students, 25 to 30 new community colleges a year. This was a boom time in higher education. First time, maybe only time, that the federal government put in huge resources to higher education. But times were changing at about this time, just about the time I was in college, and they were changing for the good in many ways. I think universities began to realize that they weren't just ivory towers where the intellectual pursuits, but they had social obligations. Students were protesting the war. Some of us were in jail for protesting the war or for civil rights. And I think it's hard to imagine now, walking around campus, what the involvement of students was in the 60s and early 70s. It was an amazing commitment and intellectual activity that moved from this abstract ivory tower business to society. And this changed eventually. I think it changed somehow society's view towards supporting of science. So it's a great contrast to me to think about the anti-war movement against Vietnam and now looking at the reactions to NRC spying or reactions on campus to almost any issue. I mean, times have changed. Students are, for good reason, focused on minimizing their student debt, getting a good job, whatever. But these weren't the times when the math community grew, when the academic community grew. And we have to adapt to these times. And there are fundamental changes from 40 years ago to now. So in retrospect, I think that we've had 30 years or so when things didn't change so much. They have been changing, but not so much, especially those of us who have had reliable, solid jobs. In fact, it may be hard to explain to young people, but in this period of good times, follow through, teaching loads throughout the country dropped. Salaries for faculty and universities kept up with inflation and sometimes passed inflation. And I think many of us just assumed that science was so important to society, mathematics was so important to society, that of course, congressmen, of course, the public at large would support us. Well, the of course isn't quite there. Now, I think we have to change, but that's not to say that I'm pessimistic or I fear for the collapse of mathematics or the collapse of the United States or something like that. In fact, I'm very optimistic. This is really, if I were talking in front of a humanities conference, and not that anyone ever asked me, I wouldn't be so optimistic. But I think mathematics has, and certainly has, a wonderful future in front of it in terms of support from society, support from universities, and in terms of course, its science. So there are all sorts of reasons for this optimism, and I mentioned this optimism before I jump into how I think and why we should change. So I think that just intellectually, this really is a golden age for mathematics. Sort of big theorems like the Poincare conjecture, Fermat's last theorem, but many, many other theorems are new and that were long outstanding, and many things are not quite at that level. One of the things that's much in the public eye is approximations to the twin prime conjecture, for example. Another thing that maybe is even more assures our future is how math intensive is so important now in other disciplines. It's amazing how it even occurs in the humanities. I guess I read in the LMS newsletter a review of a book about Jane Austen, and the author was saying that she was a closet game theorist. I mean, if you put mathematics into your science, let us say, that gives it a sheen of accuracy and disinterest at its worst, and at its best, it gives it real substance and importance. And mathematics is playing a wider and wider role in all sorts of disciplines and interests. We still do an excellent job with our undergraduate majors. At the AMS, we have data showing that math does a better job at retaining students planning to be majors than any other discipline. We still attract many of the best and brightest students. That'll happen no matter what happens to the rest of the societies. Some people will just do mathematics. We have to reach out for those who aren't so well motivated, but we have this pipeline. And of course, US is where it's at. On the other hand, I want to say we have to wake up. I want to say that times have changed and we have to adapt to it. It's easy for me to say because I'll be getting out of the business and it's up to you to do it. But I think times are changing. This is what PCAST wanted us to recognize, and we have to recognize that society's changed and things are expected of us that are to do things somewhat differently than we've done in the past. One of the things, and if we had enough time to argue back and forth, you could argue with me and I would look very silly making this argument, and you would think much less of me for doing it too. But I see that higher education now has much more focus on the economic gain for students. And there are very good reasons for this, but this economic gain, when you see universities publicizing themselves or when they're trying to recruit students or even trying to recruit faculty, this economic gain comes out first and foremost in many ways. If you talk to academic administrators, they often talk about dollars in fundraising rather than success in teaching or in research. So to some extent, knowledge and understanding have taken a backseat to utility. And that's a backdrop, a background for us, we in the trenches. And one of the best reasons for this, and this is a very good reason, and I don't think you can dispute this reason, is the student debt. Student debt is greater than mortgage debt. People, I don't know anyone like this, but I read in the New York Times that people retire not having paid back their student debt. Student debt is about the only debt you can't get released from when you declare bankruptcy. You look at some of these numbers and they're horrifying. 37 million student loan borrowers. Depending on who you ask, 1 trillion in total outstanding student debt. Average student loan balance in 2012 is over $24,000. This has to drive how students see their education, has to drive what they do when they get a degree. If you start $24,000 in the hole, you're thinking in a completely different way. And this isn't, in my day, parents sacrificed a great deal. They took out second mortgages or whatever to pay for a university. Now they're doing that, and the student in the colleges and universities absorb a lot of debt. Now we have an obligation to provide them with the wherewithal to succeed economically, as well as just to describe the beauty of mathematics. So that is part of the economic pressure on us. And another aspect of the economic pressure is the general constrained funding for resources for universities, for education programs. Those of you who work in states such as California know that funding for higher education has been reduced. This year it's up a bit, but the general trend has been down considerably, especially per capita, not taking into account even inflation. And it turns out that for reasons unrelated to faculty salaries, education costs go up as support goes down. Federal research funding is declining. It's not that much in the corporate world. So funding is constrained. Students are absorbing a lot of debt. Now, how are we funded? Now, I went to a panel discussion yesterday where one thrust of this, and I think all the distinguished panelists agreed, and it's quite contrary to this, but I think that we're basically funded not by National Science Foundation, of course. They pay a little bit of money to some of us, and we're not paid by donor contributions particularly. We're paid because we teach. This is probably as true as in most subjects in colleges and universities. And the size of academic departments of mathematics are usually determined by the number of students. Our funding is really based on our students and our students' performance. So it's extremely important to us, self-interested as well as interested in our students, to be concerned about the education we offer to our students. And of course, we're taking students now who really have this economic pressure on them. They're not out marching in demonstrations, protesting the government. They're concerned about how they're going to pay off their debt, whether they're going to be able to even stay in college long enough to get a degree. And one thing I didn't mention, it was on a slide, but I forgot, in the changes, and one of the good changes, but it's been a drastic change in what's happened in academia, is the demographics of student bodies. Now, a much broader swath of society goes to college. Now it's expected by many more people going into jobs that they have college education. I wouldn't say it's absolutely necessary to be middle class to have a college education, but it's getting close. In some sense, we hold the keys not just to having an educated perspective and an intellectual life, we hold the keys to economic success and comfort. So we have a lot of responsibility when we hold those keys. Many students come underprepared, undermotivated, and it's fairly or unfairly, it's expected of us that we retain those students to the extent possible and inspire those students to the extent possible. I mean, those students are not going to probably be math majors, they're certainly not going to be mathematicians, those who come to us unprepared and undermotivated. But they are going to be, or they can be, and I hope they will be, useful members of society and part of the middle class and happy people. And it's our role to contribute. Not only that, and this is another thing that I believe, at least obliquely, the PCAST report mentioned, is we have to reach out even more than we do to other parts of the university. It's sort of like the Rochester syndrome, to show how important we are in mathematics to them, to show how important they are to us. And it's amazingly true, but we can't just take it as say, look, a lot of what you do is mathematics and we do the mathematics. We have to take a proactive position in terms of interacting with other sciences. Well, raising the level of mathematical understanding of young people, of society as a whole, is really important. I mean, it's easy to say that what I'm doing is important and the next person says what they're doing is important, but when you look at a lot of what's happening in Congress and elsewhere, mathematical literacy or numeracy, could be statistics literacy, whatever, I'm just using mathematics as a shorthand, is very important for society. And mathematical applications and contributions of mathematics and mathematical intensive fields is essential for the United States and other countries as well. I mean, this is just a fact of life that's going to happen. What we do is important. It's just not that it's important to us, but it's important for society. And one of our tasks is to support those students who are going into science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And some of those students see mathematics as a roadblock, and somehow we have to accommodate. And we have to accommodate not by lowering standards. Somehow we have to reach students, inspire them, and engage them enough so that they succeed. They may not succeed in remembering how to prove certain theorems, but they'll succeed enough in understanding basic mathematics so they can go on in their careers. I'd also like to say I'd like to see a lot of judges and other people, legislators, know a bit more about logic and understanding that I think the entire mathematics community has. I just give one example, and I give this example because it's unfortunately very far from my knowledge, so I threw it out as because no one would dare debate me on this because I know nothing, but just one of our responsibilities is teacher training. And I'm really pleased that members of the AMS, certainly members of the mathematics community, have played an active role in creation of and designing Common Core. Many people in our community have done wonderful things for K through 12. But many of us, not me personally, also teach teachers. And this is extremely important. And we have arguments, chicken and the egg arguments, whether we should forget all about how we teach in colleges and universities to sort of science students and just focus on our teacher training. Well, we shouldn't. We should do both. But there is tremendous responsibility in teacher training, both pre-service training for teachers and in-service training after teachers graduate and come back a couple of years later. They may be motivated to get a master's just for a salary increase, but it's a time to inspire them to learn mathematics and convey it to their students. And there's a tremendous challenge to us in the mathematical sciences community. We have not very good bridges to the mathematics education community, and this has to be bridged. The mathematical education community has things to tell us about how we can improve our teaching, and we have things to tell them about why they're wrong. And I think that we really have to talk much more with the mathematics education community, and I hope that happens soon and intensively. So I'm losing track of my time, and I think I'm about a quarter of the way through, which is not very good. I'll just mention very quickly, you're going to see slides flash by very fast. There are a lot of pressures now. You might say, why? And there are a lot of pressures right now on the mathematical sciences and on universities at large. One of them is MOOCs. Whatever is going to happen to MOOCs, are they going to come in or not? Are they going to affect the workforce or not? The fact that they're bubbling up is a reflection of the time of turbulence. Another issue that I think is very important in the academic community is what I call the adjunctification of mathematics. And I have a quote here, but I'll flash by it. I just saw in the Chronicle of Higher Education, I think it was 2 days ago, about some adjuncts are becoming so common now you need some sort of web-based way of hiring adjuncts and whatever. So adjuncts are really an issue if you care about our profession, which I do, and you see the conditions and situation of adjuncts. That's a major problem, and it's a reflection of the changes that have happened in the last maybe 20 years. So there are pressures on us to change the way we teach, the methodology, and a lot of these are encapsulated in slogans. Many of the slogans, at least I don't remember what they mean, and when I get an explanation, the explanation changes from time to time. But we do have to change. Now, we try flipping the classroom. Many of us have tried this. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Interactive learning, I think everyone wants that to happen, but there are different ways to do this. Maybe we don't go for MOOCs, but we go for a hybrid where we use online resources. I think probably most of you use some sort of online resources. That's going to come more. We also have to convey what we're doing. This was a frustration in the AMS. Is so many departments, most departments I know are doing some innovation, but that innovation is not known outside the locale, and we have to collect good practices, good techniques, and promulgate them. So I don't have time to talk about this. This could have taken a great deal of time, but I don't have it. But I want to say that we have to change. And this is a great quote. It's Charles Darwin's most famous quote that Wikipedia tells me Charles Darwin didn't say. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that's most adaptable to change. So we're right. We know we're right. We're good, and we know we're good, but we have to change. So there are certain challenges that we have to confront. We have to revise pathways for students, especially at the 2-year community college level. Too many students never get to courses, much less pass courses for their associate degree. In colleges and universities, many students start out thinking they want to do science, and they get blocked because they can't pass calculus. We have to think about revising the curriculum and designing new pathways for students for whom the traditional math education wasn't a success. But we have to do this in ways that uphold standards. So we need to revise curriculum. Many universities, many departments have interesting courses. Somehow, my dream was the AMS would be a repository of, undergraduate dynamics, undergraduate financial math, all these things, and then you could go to this and learn how to present this class, and the creator of the course would be willing to answer questions and whatever. We need to do more of this. We need to cooperate with other disciplines. We need to think our methodology. Whatever you think about clickers or whatever you think about MOOCs, we've got to at least be open to change. And we've got to show that we're willing to change, we're willing to assess what we're doing, and if, despite our intuitions, if certain things work better than others, we have to adapt them. And I guess I have no time to mention this, we have to rethink some of our graduate training, because graduate students are going to enter the workforce, at least in the academic workforce, that's very different from the workforce I entered. Already, I think all graduate students get some classroom training, but they probably need more training. We have to think that through. There are all these things that we have to change, but there's so many things that I hope we never change. And I list some of them, and probably if I asked somebody out in the audience to make a list, there'd be no overlap, although we'd agree with each other on what things the union probably has to be. So basic research has been part of my life. Intellectual honesty and rigor, I think mathematics is distinguished by that. There's very little fraud. We don't make a big deal of even pointing out when there is fraud. We just, our whole society is an honest one, and we have to protect that. We embrace originality wherever it comes from. There's diversity in terms of national diversity. There's now much more gender diversity. There's not so much ethnic diversity yet. We have to promote that even further. But I'd like to think there are very few biases in mathematics. We welcome good mathematics wherever it comes from. And I hope that means good mathematics teaching also. We support our young. After all, we know that that's the next generation. If we support our subject, if we believe in our subject, we continue that. And that means whatever it is, math camps, REUs, encouraging high school students or undergraduates. All of these are important things that we're not going to change. We're not going to give up. So I wanted to give an advertisement for an activity that some of us are involved in. We call it Tipsy Math. You might think that's because we think that math is teetering a little bit. It stands for Transforming Post-Secondary Education in Mathematics. And it's led by Jim Gates, Mark Green, Philip Griffiths, Tara Holm, Uri Treisman. I haven't seen everyone of those in the room, but they're in the room and you can ask them about it. And the first activity, public activity that this group is going to have will happen tomorrow, Friday, as a second panel discussion. It starts at 4:30, and I hope you all will come. And it will look at in depth and with more intelligence and more expertise than I've done. And this panel is a very distinguished panel, and it represents different perspectives on the issue of the future of education and post-secondary mathematics. Michelle Cahill represents philanthropy. Joe Handelsman represents PCAST and possibly the federal government. Britt Kerwin represents academic administration. I'm being very quick on this. And Joan Leitzel, although she was a president of a university, represents statewide initiatives. So this is a very distinguished panel, and Philip Griffiths will be moderating it, and I think they'll have some interesting and thoughtful things to say about where we should be heading and what the situation is. So I want to thank you for your attention, and it's your future as well as my future, but it's in your hands. Preserve it. Thank you. I don't know if the venue is appropriate for questions. If someone wants to ask a question, just come forward unless, I don't know if there are microphones. If you want to make a statement, there are microphones there. Like, I disagree with everything he says. Stand up to number 5 there and speak to the microphone. But I and all of us, like on this Tipsy panel, are delighted to discuss this at length. And I'm supposed to have a slide here to advertise the ICM in Seoul. Is there such a slide? It hasn't arrived yet.